Then we'll dive into British history and James Mill specifically, who unfortunately is a long forgotten figure who should be a hero to the British people and needs to be lynched in India at the same time. And if we look at William Jones, who commented on the history, what he says is Mill tortured the text, ignoring context, ignoring continuity, and only focusing on the parts that furthered his mission and his objective. Another example, look, as a country, we couldn't move forward if we didn't know English, and that is a colonial legacy. Now, I happen to work for an Israeli firm, and what I know is a group of people that have pride in their own language, can do business globally, speaking in Hebrew, which is a language very few people in the world speak.
So namaste everyone. We are honored to have with us Shri Krishna Maheshwari ji for today's book talk, and the title of this book talk is Colonial Discourse on the Suffering of Indians. Krishna ji has an MBA from Harvard Business School and an MS in computer engineering from Cornell University. And he is also the Chief Product Officer at Neuroblade, and he is also the founder of Hindupedia. The book under consideration today is Colonial Discourse on the Suffering of Indian American Children, a Francophone post-colonial analysis. This book addresses the psychosocial consequences that are faced by the Indian American children after reading the school textbooks on Hinduism, and he discusses and starts by discussing the book titled The History of British India, which was published in the early 19th century by James Mill, and he deconstructs that book and the ideas there by using some French post-colonial thinkers. Now I request you, sir, to kindly proceed with your lecture.
Before we begin, how many of you have used the term mythology हमारे शास्त्रों के बारे में बात करने के लिए? आज हम उसको सुधारने की बात नहीं करेंगे. We're going to talk about why the term exists in the first place. How many of you have wished we had a better status than mythology? No one.
Better status.
Better status than mythology. Acceptance of Shastra. Right? So we're going to uncover how we can get there together. We don't talk about that here, but you will see the pathways open up as we go through the talk. We'll begin with an introduction about Hindupedia and the work that we're trying to do, and how this work fits in the context of the overall efforts that we're making. Then we'll talk about politics and the politics of academia, as well as the realities of academia. Then we'll get into the colonial narrative, which we all collectively suffer from. So if you think about the book, the first 4 chapters is where we're going to focus. The 2/3 of the book is where we're going to focus today. It stops at the suffering of Indians. The last 2 chapters deal with the suffering of Indian American children. We're going to skip that. In some ways, it's a little bit less relevant here. Although I have heard there are certain relevancies that can be drawn when you look across specific economic strata in India. But still, it made sense not to focus there. Then we'll dive into British history and James Mill specifically, who unfortunately is a long forgotten figure who should be a hero to the British people and needs to be lynched in India at the same time. And we'll talk about the tools. What are some of the tools that we used for the analysis? Because in doing so, what we will see is we're not alone. This didn't only happen to us. We kind of live in a narrow worldview where we only see ourselves and what we suffer from. And sometimes it makes sense to open the aperture and look at the rest of the world and what they suffered from, and see if we can draw lessons. So we use these tools in the analysis ourselves, but we're going to spend some time focusing only on the tools. And I'll draw some comparisons to make it connect to here, but most of it will be in Algeria and Tunisia. And lastly, we're going to talk about collaboration. Again, collaboration is important because we need to foster research here at Rishihood and the rest of India. It is also important in the politics of scholarship, because only if you have collaboration does your idea have worth. And only if your idea has worth can you drive change. So Hindupedia started in 2007 with an insight. When my friends asked Krishna, should I take this course on Hinduism at my university? Now, I was born and brought up in the US, so the context was always in the context of, the question was in the context of a US university. The answer universally was, please don't, because I'll lose a friend and gain an enemy. And that was in undergrad. It's much worse at the master's level, even worse at the PhD level. And over the course of the years, I've spent a lot of time talking to a lot of different academics and building academic coalitions. And it's even worse there. So we started with building an online encyclopedia. At the undergraduate level, the only material that people have access to is anti-Hindu in nature, written with a conversion agenda. And it's not just only, there's a lot of it. Generations and generations of it. So there's reams of data that can be accessed, and all of it hurtful to us. And then we published the book on the right, Making Children Hindu-Phobic. This came after a multi-year effort in the California State Board of Education. So in 2015 to 2018 was the second time that the Hindu community stood up to drive change. California opens its process once a decade, and whatever they agree on lasts for 10 years. Not only that, but the rest of the US takes the same set of materials. So in other words, whatever they approve is exposed to, taught, tested on by 100 million kids and all of their teachers. So as Hindupedia is a research organization, not an activist one, we still felt compelled to participate. So we were in a coalition of many other Hindu groups, but we did all of the research, all of the analysis, and we distributed it across everyone. And it was in the middle of that I got to meet Professor Singh, who's my co-author, and was the only academic on the side of the Hindus in that process that was there without being paid for being there. He was there of his own volition. Every other academic was on a business trip to prevent change, to prevent improvement. He had a key role in the first part of that process, and the analysis he did improved the state-developed curricula. We didn't get across the finish line, but we made a lot of improvements. Those we hope we don't lose out on when the process starts again next year. And then he had to leave for India, and I ended up taking the mantle as part of the Hindupedia team. And we reviewed 7 different sets of instructional materials by 7 different publishers. At the end of the process, we were successful in getting Houghton Mifflin Harcourt effectively banned from California. That was the first time in the history of California, and probably the history of the US, any company had been financially damaged, not hurt, damaged, because of anti-Hindu content. Their stock price dropped by 14% at the time of the decision. As they recognized the revenue loss over 3 years, it resulted in them going private, being bought out by financial equity firms, private equity firms. Then we published Making Children Hindu-Phobic, because despite that win, we actually lost. That publisher lost 55% market share in California. The second largest publisher was equally bad and had a bonanza. So they took over much of that empty market, and the materials remained largely terrible. At the end of that process, Professor Singh joined as a senior fellow at Hindupedia, and we started research. What we wanted to do is make sure we don't lose what we had gained in the intervening decade. Somewhere along the way, we ran into James Mill, and all our timelines went out the window. And the book we have today was not what we imagined we would be producing 5 years ago. Now, one thing that's notable about the book is that it is one of the few books that went blind peer review by 3 different professors, cover to cover. most academic works get maybe a chapter or two reviewed. And it's now landed in academia, which means we're at milestone number 1 in a very long journey. The reason Hindupedia exists is because we want change and removal of Hindumesia from academia. Dropping individual works is not good enough. Now, the political reality, and this is the politics of academia, is when you look at scholarship, this is US-based scholarship. This is European-based scholarship, again in the Western scholarship model. Rishihood largely fits in the Western scholarship model, as well as every other Indian university somewhere down here. So notice the gap. And then if you look at traditional scholarship models, and Indian traditional scholarship is a subset of that, they're way down here. What that means is our traditional scholars simply have zero standing. Zero. No matter how strong they are in their fields, and sometimes how indignant they are about the fact that others don't listen to them. But it also means we're impaired over here in terms of our access to publish. And we need to recognize that political reality and deal with it. Now, in terms of Hindu phobia, we know there are at least 2,000 scholars and professors who have signed on public letters supporting anti-Hindu objectives. And we know that's not a complete list. There are many more. We also know that Hindu-phobic representation exists in all fields. But one thing we have to keep in mind, and this is a theme you'll hear over and over again, no one likes to think of themselves as hateful. Not us in this room, not Hindu-hating academics, not colonialists. It's very hard for a human psychologically to think of themselves as hurtful. However, it's very easy to say, look, there's an expert, he said so, I'm just repeating facts. Now I'm not being hateful, and I can live with that. And that is true of everyone else. And I mentioned academics have it even worse than students. In Western academia, and I can say this about the US, I can't say it's so much about India, but I hear it's largely true as well. If you are an academic in the social sciences, and you want a career studying something related to Hindu Dharma, you as a professor will stay on the fringe, working on obscure topics that no one understands and has no relevance, and therefore you can have a peaceful career. If you want to work on topics that will change the narrative, that go to the core of the discourse, your career will be curtailed. And it's harsh to say, but there are cases where you get drummed out. And that is the reality. These are pictures from 6th grade textbooks that were in textbooks till about 2018. The one on the left is Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. The one on the right is Discovery Education. I keep these images even though we were successful in getting them removed, because the narrative is still the same. And a picture is worth 1,000 words, so why use the 1,000 words? But what is the narrative that still remains? Hindu Dharma is a recent invention. It came about because we consolidated a bunch of ragtag set of religions. At its core, it's caste, hierarchy, and oppression. The majority of us oppress the majority of our brethren on a daily basis. That is the defining trait of Hindu Dharma. Not only that, but every level of Hindu society is oppressive. Whether it's our kings, our monarchies, our present-day leadership. They are oppressive because Hindu Dharma is oppressive. Buddhism, on the other hand, is emancipatory. It is an improvement on Hindu Dharma. So let's look over there. Let's stop looking over here at Hinduism. And finally, our epics, our Shastra, whenever they do find mention, are also centered on caste. And while they don't explicitly and necessarily mention hierarchy and oppression, that is very implicit. And children make those connections instantly. Now, this is Hindu Dharma. What about everyone else? Islam, Christianity, Judaism. Those are perfect religions and perfect civilizations that have done no harm done no wrong over the course of their entire history. So as a student, when you get exposed to this narrative, that has a very specific implication on you. But it's not just that. As adults, when we see this in the media in largely the same ways, it has the same ramification on you. And within the context of India, it also has the same ramification on all of us. It's not a uniquely American problem. We're going to switch topics a little bit and talk about colonialism. Who thought when we gained independence, we were free of colonial rule? We typically think of it as political and geographic control. Unfortunately, it's not. We are still under colonial rule. We're trying to get ourselves out. Colonialism was also about systematic and systemic destruction of traditional colonized knowledge systems. There's epistemic and epistemological warfare at its core. Because remember I said no one wants to feel bad about themselves, that they're hateful? If you're on a colonizing mission, and on the other side, you only have savage, barbaric people that have no civilization, then you can feel good. You're bringing civilization to a people. But for that, you have to prove that they have no civilization, that they are savage, they are barbaric. And that is what colonization is all about. Post-colonial studies as a field arose because of the need for post-colonial societies to heal from this damage. It's a field that largely has excluded India and Hindu Dharma, mostly because we chose not to participate, not because there was any intentional malice. And so when we get to the tools section, we'll talk about some of the societies that did choose to participate in the scholarship that they brought on. Now, there are two categories, Anglophone and Francophone. Anglophones wrote in English, Francophones wrote in French. But there was also another angle to it. The Anglophones focused mostly on economic impact of colonization. And it's undoubtable there was massive economic impact. And here we have some scholarship to show that as well. And it's also come into common discourse. Francophones wrote about the psychological impact of colonization. This is a place where we simply didn't do any work until now. And when the Francophones look at it, they say, economic impact is there, but because it is a part of the overall damage that is done, we have to look at the overall part. We have to make sure the psychological healing happens as well. And we're hoping that this work and the deconstruction that we've started allows us as a scholastic community to start that process here. We're going to switch to British history. Anyone here study the utilitarian movement in England? Bentham was one of the founders of that movement. He is a tall figure in British history. His disciple was James Mill. James Mill's son, John Stuart Mill, is another towering figure in British history. So what we have is a man stuck in the middle between his mentor and his son, and forgotten in history as a consequence. But this man is the one that wrote our narrative that we suffer from today. Now, he drove the utilitarian reforms in Britain. That's a towering achievement. Now, as part of doing that, or at the start of that effort, he wrote the History of British India. Now, you have to consider the libel laws in Britain at the time when he published. If he wrote strongly against the monarchy, or against the aristocracy, against the clergy, he would have been thrown in jail. So what does a journalist and a budding philosopher do? Remove it from the context of Britain so he can talk about it freely. Then, I'm not talking about you, sir. I'm not talking about the king. Why? I'm free. I don't need to go to jail. And we will prove, and by going through examples of how he did it. Fortunately for him, Indian society was far removed and safe to discuss about in any context he so chose. And so he used that. Now, if we think about his context and some of his words in the opening chapters, he says there's more to learn about India in his closet than there is by ever visiting India. And so he was proud about the fact he never came here. Now, this 3-volume work was amazing for his career because it took him into the East India Company and he rose to its head on the basis of this work. So this text, which started out as a critique on Britain, took a life of its own. Now, he was a prolific writer over the course of his life. As the reforms started to go through, he felt freer and freer to write about Britain in the context of Britain. And so what we can do now is start to look at it and to understand what he wrote and try to draw some connections. But coming back to what he did was he took this work as head of the East India Company, and he brought it to East India College, which is where all the civil servants from the East India Company that came to India to govern India were trained. And that became the first institutional teaching of India in Britain. And that set of materials then went to Cambridge and to Oxford, and from there to every other university around the world. And we're now in roughly 6 generations of scholarship, all built on that fundamental paradigm, that fundamental piece of fiction that he wrote. So we looked at it in the course of the book through a bunch of different lenses. We looked at it based on Professor Singh's own work on binaries. We won't delve into that today. We took a look at the work from Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, and Albert Memmi. And we looked at James's own writings. We'll start with the last bit, then we'll come to the others. But one thing we learned from Bal Gangadharji is when you look at colonial writings, it gives you a view into the colonizer himself, because he is writing from his own worldview. So you can accept it as being truthful or not, that's a choice, but you get a gaze into his perspective about himself. And that was one of the inspirations for looking at his own writings and comparing them across time. We also know he started his writings a lot earlier, but he hesitated on publishing. So the amount of coincidence is not purely coincidental. There is a relationship that can be proven when you look at the timelines in detail. Now we have a bunch of examples, and I'm going to read part of them, and you can read most of them here. Now, I did take the liberty of removing some of the text in the middle of these quotes just to make it fit on the slide. So in the article Ecclesiastical Establishments, which is something he was writing about the Church of England, and specifically the British clergy, he writes, "In ecclesiastical language, the wealth and the power of the clergy are religion. But breathe on the interests of the clergy, make them surmise discredit at your hands, and you are the enemy of religion directly, nay, the enemy of your God." In other words, do not go against the interests of the church. Simply put, if you want to do reform, you will be excommunicated. And this is problematic from his perspective and from the utilitarian perspective. And when he writes about India, he applies and he projects what he was thinking about the clergy onto the Brahmins of India. The priesthood is generally found to usurp the greatest authority in the lowest state of society. The Brahmins among the Hindus have acquired and maintained an authority more exalted, more commanding, and more extensive than the priests have been able to engross among any other portions of mankind. And then he continues, the distance between our divinity and our Brahmins is as large as the distance between the Brahmins and the rest of society. If you've looked at Indian history and the ideals of Brahmins, does this reflect at all with what we find in our own scholarship and our own teachings? No. But this was never about the Brahmins in the first place. So that makes sense. Now in another article, Church and Its Reform, he starts with, the divine author of our religion everywhere indicates the opinion that praying is nothing but a ceremony. And he continues on talking about how ceremony is unnecessary and not helpful for improving morals of people. When he comes to us, when the exaggerations of flattery are engrafted upon the original deification of the elements and powers of nature, and then he talks again about the Brahmins. They compose a more stupendous mass in Hinduism than any other country. Right? The amount of ceremonies that Brahmins have engrafted, it's more than anywhere else in the world. The absurdity, the folly of the endless ceremonies of which practical part of the Hindu religion consists. He's taking his problems with ceremony in the Church of England and grafting them and exaggerating upon them on us. Now, if we continue on morality, we have often asked ourselves after hearing such a sermon whether any human being could possibly have received one useful impression from it. So in the church, it's common practice to have a weekly sermon on Sundays. That is when your clergy gets on the pulpit, gives a lecture for whatever length. And what he found was it was largely useless. It did not improve the morality of the people at all over time. So he wanted it changed. When he comes to us, no circumstance connected with the religious system more decidedly pronounces on its character than the ideas which it includes respecting merit and demerit, purity, impurity, innocence, and guilt. And then he continues. He's grafting the problems he has with the clergy and with a weekly sermon. How many of you know a Brahmin who gives any sort of sermon, much less a weekly one? It didn't exist in our history at all. But suddenly it is a defining trait. Now if we skip to aristocracy, whether the powers of government are placed in any hands, that of one man, meaning the king, or of a few men, meaning the aristocracy, think the legislative assembly, then they will make use of it to defeat the very end for which government exists. In other words, they're going to gather power onto themselves and not use it for the benefit of the people. And the reason government exists in his mind is to benefit the people. When he comes to us, the government was monarchical and, with the usual exception of its religion and its ministers, absolute. Then he continues, the king alone is entitled to judge, and his judgments are vague and arbitrary and inconsistent over time. Now if we look today, and we'll look at the discourse today around our own government. Now what I'm making is not a political statement, but we have a prime minister who's a self-proclaimed Hindu. Now he's a prime minister, not a monarch, but if you think about governance, he's as close to a monarch as you could possibly be in this country in this day and age. And then look at the Western media narrative on the present government. And this narrative continues to map one-to-one. Then he goes on in an article entitled Law and Civil Code, Penal Code, and the Code of Procedure. Here he talks about the ideals of law, that they should be complete and they should be exact. Complete in the sense of everything that should be required is there, and everything beyond just that is required is not. In other words, when a punishment needs to be applied, there should only be so much punishment to prevent a bad action in the first place. Anything beyond that is excessive. And it needs to be exact because we want the same well-defined punishments and the same well-defined laws to apply over and over and over again to the people. And then he gets to the Manusmriti. Now keep in mind, this was probably one of the few, if not the only, of the Dharma Shastras that was translated at the time. But we also know he didn't try very hard. And if we look at William Jones, who commented on the history, what he says is, Mill tortured the text, ignoring context, ignoring continuity, and only focusing on the parts that furthered his mission and his objective. So what he says is they acknowledge nothing as law but that which is found in one or other of their sacred texts. Many parts of the law are untouched, and in these parts a defect must be supplied by custom. And then he keeps going on, but fundamentally what he's saying is we are complete because our laws are divine laws, but those divine laws are so vague that you can take any meaning and multiple meanings from them. So they might as well not exist. They're useless. So even though they're theoretically complete, they're practically non-existent and incomplete. And then he uses the same to talk about exactness. And then he says, we have too many rights. They're excessive. We're not minimal. We're not maximal. We're somewhere off the charts. And then we're extraneous again, and we don't subdivide and classify our laws properly, and we don't organize them. And then when we come to judgment, the judges are arbitrary as well. They will say something for you today. Tomorrow, if you do the same thing, you'll get a different punishment. And you'll get a different punishment the day after. Different judges are not held to the same standard. They're not required to repeat what's happened before them. What he was doing was pushing written judgments in Britain to drive consistency of judgment and judiciary in England. And what better way to do it than talk about a people that have such arbitrary judicial process to make it completely unfair for their people. He talks about taxation, and about England, the great evil of this mode of satisfying the aristocracy with the property of the people is that it takes from the people more than it gives to the aristocracy. Then he goes on, it's about creating pretext, because you have to justify the reason to tax people. And how do you do that? You go on colonial adventures, suddenly you have to pay for them. You need to fund an army. But guess what? The senior officers are also aristocrats, and they take a majority of the money again. When he goes to India, he says taxation is completely arbitrary. The king applies whatever tax he wants, whenever he wants, and the people have nothing, because they're excessively taxed in a very arbitrary way. Again, he's reflecting what he wants corrected in an exaggerated way, transplanted onto India. So we'll talk a little bit about the tools, and specifically Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, and Albert Memmi. There are a bunch of books here. I highly recommend all of them. And we'll talk about how we use them, not necessarily cover them end to end. One thing I'm going to repeat over and over again, they did not focus on India. They focused on their home countries, Algeria and Tunisia. But what we know is post-colonial societies around the world have leveraged these works to start the healing process in their home countries. Some key themes. There's a dialectical relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. There's an oppositional relationship. They're opposite poles. And what privileges the colonizer is only at the detriment of the colonized. If I want to speak highly about the colonizer, I can only be high when I can speak lowly about the colonized. To do that, colonizers, and again, this is focused on European colonization. And so if I step away for 1 second, India had 2 waves of colonization, Islamic and European. We're focused on the European right now. And these authors are focused on European colonization. Colonizers fabricate whatever they want, and they do it in a way that lets them claim objectivity and rationality. And fundamentally, this work is about assuaging guilt. I started with, I don't want to feel hateful, and neither did they. So if they can prove that we as a people, the Algerians as a people, the Tunisians as a people, were savage and barbaric, then they can be justified in bringing a civilizing mission. In US and in American history, we called it the white man's burden. It is the same thing playing out. And to do that, you have to dehumanize, you have to animalize, and you have to objectify the colonized people. If they're not human, then they can't have civilization. And at its core, it's racism. If you look at the definition of racism, it's the generalizing definition and valuation of differences, whether real or imaginary, to the advantage of the one defining and deploying them, and to the detriment of the one subjected to that act of definition, whose purpose is to justify social and physical hostility and assault. In our context, we're focusing on the social. Obviously, there was also a physical angle to it. And sadly, the social element still exists and perpetuates today. Now, if we look at this dialectical relationship, the colonizer was white, so the colonized was dark and black. The colonizer had the idea of civilization. Therefore, the colonized were savage and barbaric. The colonizer had culture, so therefore the colonized were animals and subhuman. The colonized were the creators of order, and the colonized were creators of chaos. The colonized are messengers of God, and the colonized are children of evil. So I'll just pick on one line there, the second to last, order and chaos. How many of you have heard the trope of Indian Standard Time? Or the fact that Indians can't keep anything on time? I was reading work by a different French author. He talked about the fact that Indians showed up at the train station when trains were introduced consistently 3 hours late. not realizing the train wouldn't wait for them. Then they started showing up 3 hours early, but they couldn't get themselves to stay on time. Now, I'm not saying this is an actual reflection of what happened, but this is how they talked about us as a people. And those stereotypes and tropes perpetuate today. Indian Standard Time is something I heard about and we talk about in the US even today. Now, the colonizer has to justify to himself and the colonized the act of colonization. How do you do that? You extinguish the memory of history and the identity of the colonized. These authors talk about Egypt and Nubia, which was a civilization in Egypt prior to the pharaohs, and how their contributions to Europe have simply been wiped out of European history. You can find about Nubia in the context of Egypt, but not Nubia in the context of Europe. Their contributions are simply gone. They create laws, morals, false history. Remember, the project is to fabricate something that assuages their guilt. So they will make up anything and everything necessary to do so. This is where we see our texts become mythology. Because if they were history, we had civilization. If they're mythology, then they're just made up stories for children. And then you look at the stories and they're fantastical. What great bedtime stories. Or what great examples of evil. They dehumanize the colonized through words, laws, books, and media. And that's not good enough. They also have to make a public show of their virtues. Now, in the context, has anyone heard about the trope that the British brought the railways to India? What an amazing job that they did. We couldn't exist as a country without it. That's an example of making a public show of a virtue. Another example, look, as a country, we couldn't move forward if we didn't know English, and that is a colonial legacy. Now, I happen to work for an Israeli firm, and what I know is a group of people that have pride in their own language, can do business globally, speaking in Hebrew, which is a language very few people in the world speak. So you don't need to have English to survive in this world and to prosper in this world. And that's one example of many. But again, this is a trope that persists. And it is this legacy. Now, scholarly work in this context takes an interesting and amazing twist. When we come to the Algerians, Dr. Gustave Le Bon proved using science that the prefrontal cortex of the brain in the Algerians was underdeveloped. So physiologically, they were not capable of governing themselves. Because they weren't capable of governing themselves, thank God the colonial powers came to give them governance. The key here is they proved, using science, that this was true. Fundamentally, it's motivated research. You go to prove something, you find the ways to make it proven, and then you justify it as, look, I use science. In other contexts, they remove the concept of history and time and evolution. So look at all your texts as if they were written at one point of time. And suddenly, the animalism comes out, everything else comes out, and you look very different as a society than you actually are. And then, of course, there's outright destruction, which also happens. So fundamentally, what they're doing is legitimizing these fabrications that they're spending a lot of time, money, and resources on building. They start by creating vast lexicons of official words, gestures, administrative texts, and political conduct. This is the guise of governance and bureaucracy. Now, once you have that mass, then you want to create organizations that institute these fabrications in the society of the colonized people. And in order to do that, you don't only have your own intellectuals, you also graft intellectuals from the colonized people themselves. And you use them to perpetuate. What that means is when you look around, again, bringing the context back to India, even though this work is not in the context of India, you see the racist tropes and the racist theories coming not from people of another race, but from your own race. They're Indians that push this theory coming out of Indian academia, from India, not even abroad. Now, they continue long after the masters have gone home. We see that in present day life. But what happens is when those colonizers leave, they create a void. Someone has to fill that gap of scholarship. And there's only one set of people capable of doing so that exist. So they do. Now they also benefit from all of the colonial machinery that exists. And they perpetuate it and keep it running. But keep in mind, their own education is only in the context of this colonial framework. So they don't know any better either. Now, whether it's in Africa or in India, we live in this colonial framework. So if I now focus only on India, every single one of us in this room, me included, was trained in the colonial framework because our schooling came from that framework and our professors came from that framework. And collectively, we have been perpetuating it on ourselves, against ourselves. But that's not just us. I can speak from my experience. These authors spoke from their experience that this was happening in Algeria and Tunisia and in other societies. Anyone open up a brown nariyal? Brown on the outside, white on the inside. In the US, we use this to describe many of ourselves. Now, I don't know if you look carefully at the pictures of the books that I showed earlier. One of them was black skin and white masks. So the same thing applied to the Africans. Now, why is that? You start by creating a feeling of insecurity and inferiority. Everything that is great came from the colonizer. Everything you had was complete gutter trash. So what do you want? You want to be great. Great is over there. It looks like that. It feels like that. It tastes like that. So that's what you want. And what you have is inferior. Now, when that happens, you look to the white world because that is where everything good comes from. And then that white world comes inside you. Because again, the feeling has to come from somewhere. And after that, you start disassociating with your own culture and your own religion, and worse, your own people. I have plenty of stories speaking to people in the US of this. But sadly, I also have plenty of stories of speaking to people in India of this being equally true. And we can see strata in our own society where you can see this stark difference. And I remember not a few years ago, there was critique about Fair and Lovely. Right? Why do we all want to be fair? Are people in the South that happen to be dark-skinned not beautiful? It comes from this. So a couple of rules of thumb from the world of psychology. Repressed and unconscious things get projected onto some form of scapegoat. If you repress something, you can't actually repress it. It has to come out. And so you look at something and you say, okay, that thing represents whatever it is that I was repressing and hiding in my unconscious. Now, when you look at evil and darkness, the European colonizers took that and put it on all the non-white people. And consequently, evil became associated with black. In the Christian worldview, when you look around, evil is always black. It's always dark. And suddenly, that again maps to us also being that children of evil. And so, what can we conclude? The colonial project is fundamentally racist. It's an act of racism. You have superiority of the white race over the non-white races. And we talked about it in the context of Europe and Africa. You can apply it in the context of the US and the European natives of the US versus the Native Americans in the US. You can also apply it in India and in the rest of Asia, wherever the colonial project went. Making stuff up is the most prominent feature of colonialism. They fabricate reality. and they impose that reality onto us. They do it by 3 steps. First, they create a gulf in the culture. Now, what's a gulf? It's not about something you artificially create, it's about how you describe what exists. I have culture, you don't, in many different words. Then you exploit it for the benefit of the colonized. And once you've done that, you use those differences to make it an absolute fact that I have culture and you don't. Right? And once you've gotten here, you then ingrain in your actions, in your institutions, this is the reality. I have culture, you don't. I have society, you don't. I am a human, you are an animal. Now, once you encode that in society and societal institutions, you start encoding it into laws. Anyone heard about voting in the US? And specifically, a black man was worth, if I remember correctly, half of a white man. This is post-slavery society in the US, before the vote was rolled out to African Americans. It's the same. Now, a racist describes his victims as incomprehensible, impenetrable, mysterious, strange, disturbing. Again, there aren't enough words in the thesaurus, so we end up repeating them over and over again. But we do so in the context of this presentation only because the colonized literature does the same. They also use all of these words. We haven't gone to the thesaurus looking, we looked at their texts and started picking. So it happens over and over and over and over again. Now, if we look at these 3 authors and start summarizing, what we see is the colonizer spent a lot of time, money, and effort establishing this narrative. It wasn't a side project, it wasn't a small project, it was a central feature because it justified the act of colonization to themselves and their people and assuaged their guilt. And as part of this, he took every possible measure to elevate his own position and to denigrate the position of the colonized. He constructed the colonized in every country that they went as barbaric and uncivilized, as animals. And he created this dialectical relationship. And from there, he continued to portray, again, the European colonizers, that they're the ones bringing civilization because they're the only ones that are civilized. In fact, they're the only ones who could conceive of the idea of civilization. And then they provide the intellectual and scholarly rationale for that continued colonization. And then lastly, when they've left, not only do they continue to fund the institutions that they left, but the people that they left behind continue to support those institutions over the course of their lifetimes. And then they educate others and bring them in. And so it perpetuates generation after generation after generation. And so we end up where we are today, where our intellectuals are perpetuating the violent documentation of myth established as fact in our own society. But Césaire, Fanon, and Memmi, we're talking about this in the context of Africa. But when we go through this, each of us individually can draw the parallels for ourselves with what we see here. Any questions?
So I think we can talk about the details, the academic details later. But I was simply wondering that when you talk about academic politics, for instance, then basically using knowledge to forward your geopolitical agenda, economic agenda. I mean, that is occurring right now through, let's say, information warfares, for instance. And even when you're talking about all of these things, I mean, this basically, would you agree that this falls largely under the rubric of what you would call Orientalism, sides work in particular? So I was wondering that you have a plan from a counter plan to that, but what's your economics for this, if I were to ask? Because you're literally dealing with a behemoth out there. I mean, I know there are others probably like Elon Musk who would take a different viewpoint than what's happening, but how do you fund such a project going ahead?
So there were 2 parts to that. The first part is around Orientalism. And I didn't read Bal Gangadharji's quote and the slight modification that we made to it, but he talks about Orientalism in his work. And what we ask is you do a find and replace on Orientalism with colonialism. And his work maps one-to-one with our work. Personally, I think Orientalism puts a very nice veneer to it. And when you call it colonization, which is what it actually is, then it exposes the facade explicitly. The financial model is something very different. Right? I choose to fund a lot of this work out of my own pocket because it is very hard to get society as a whole to fund deep academic research. Right? We spent 4 years researching. And when we look at the academic model in general, most academics, they teach in a supported environment, and then their communities also give them consulting work. So at least in the US, they're very well compensated. Now, I didn't talk about it earlier, but when I was going and building academic coalitions as part of the textbook reform efforts, I talked to academics that were late in their career, and they were willing to do work and put their name in front. Many of them chose to publish their best work towards the end of their career. I talked to academics that would be willing to do work and help as long as their names didn't show up anywhere. I talked to academics that would exchange emails with me, but they wouldn't do work and their names wouldn't show up anywhere. And I also talked to academics that would talk with me as long as there was no communication over email, for fear that their name might get out. Right? Now, all of these academics, what was common to them was they were doing something in the social sciences with relation to Hindu Dharma. This is the only field where that happens. As a community, we don't step up to support our academics because we see our academics as Brahmins fundamentally. We don't call them that. That is what they are. And we have this painful legacy of James Mill that teaches us all the bad things about Brahmins, which fundamentally wasn't ever about them in the first place. But that is the narrative that we have. And so if we need change, we don't need broad society to step up to drive it. Because narratives are built by faceless scholars in small rooms and small in number. You don't need a lot of them. But as their ideas catch on, they go through society under different names. Credit goes to different people. But those that started it, that did the research, they know who they are. And I believe that is largely the same here, which is why we have the funding model that we do. Frankly, it was easier for me to pay for it than to get others to contribute. Now, that's not to say we don't get contributions, we do, but they're a small part of our budget. But that's also why I'm here offering collaboration opportunities. Remember, we live in the context of academia and academic politics. So, and I said this book is a first step. Too many of our academics have published and moved on, and consequently their work was ignored. And how do we prevent that from being ignored here after we spent 5 years of our life getting it through a mainstream publisher? Is to make sure we collaborate. If we collaborate, what does that mean? That means you do additional work in relation to and expanding upon the work that we've done, and you cite and reference our work. Fundamentally, the metric that matters here is citation count. And as your citation count of a work goes up, suddenly other scholars have no choice but to review your work, otherwise their literature survey is incomplete, and their ideas get cut. And then they have to react. And that's when you drive real change. So we're looking for 3 types of collaboration. 1, journal publications that continue the deconstruction work we started. And we're also starting to focus on the next phase of our own work, which I won't talk about. But this is one area we're looking for collaboration. The other is on construction. What are our perspectives on everything that we are? And the third, recognizing that I'm speaking in English about a work in English when the majority of her people don't speak English. These concepts, these ideas, these tools, this narrative needs to be made available in Indic languages. And I'm also here sharing some collaboration topics. You can choose to go at it without us. If you want to work with us, of course, we're happy to work together. We know through our own research, James Mill wasn't just writing for the sake of written. That may be where the work started, but as he grew in power and he took this on to India, it drove changes in Indian society. Just like we see the post-colonial writers talking about African society. Laws were made, bureaucracies were established to further that narrative. So we need to deconstruct and expose all of it, in all of its facets. We also need to look at the intersection of that with the other contexts we're involved in. For example, the California Constitution as it relates to children's textbooks. We need to go look at his scholarly ideas, right? This work was published in 1807, it's 2024. The narrative continues. What is that progression? If James Mill is the core trunk of a banyan tree, what are all the other roots that are themselves trunks in their own right? If you can't understand the scholastic journey, you can't do anything about it. So we need to understand that. We also need to do longitudinal studies. What is the impact of the discourse on people? How has it harmed them? Can we talk about it in a pure psychological context and bring that into the scholastic world? And so we also recognize, as a small group, we can't do it on our own. Because one can create an idea by planting a seed, but the community has to water that seed. And so that's not a funding model, it's a we're in it together model. And we're now at a stage where the seed has been planted, and we need help watering it.